He stood in the doorway with that ease only youth can afford duffel bag slung over his shoulder, a light tan on his skin from somewhere warmer than our suburb, and a tired smile that didn't quite hide how little he wanted to be here. My husband greeted him first casually, like welcoming a distant colleague, then turned back to his laptop before the front door had even closed. I stayed longer in the hallway than I should have, my eyes adjusting to a presence I hadn't prepared for. They hadn't lived together since he was a teenager, and even then, only in stretches. I knew the stories, his withdrawn silences, his mother's bitterness, the tension that thickened in the air when they were in the same room. But now he was a man. Quiet still, but grounded. His voice was deeper, his gait slower, heavier. He carried himself like someone used to navigating around fragile things. He moved into the guest room at the back of the house. We hadn't used it in months, and I spent the morning cleaning folding towels, smoothing the sheets a little too carefully. I placed a scented candle on the dresser, then removed it 5 minutes later. It felt too personal. At dinner, my husband talked mostly to himself about numbers, logistics, supply chain bottlenecks. I stirred my food, nodding when required, my mind elsewhere. Across the table, he was listening. The young man. He barely spoke, but when he did, it was to me. Light questions, neutral observations. But his eyes didn't wander like his father's. They stayed focused. Still, I wore a robe that night I hadn't worn in a while, silky pale gray, hugging the curve of my back. I told myself it was for comfort. I didn't check the mirror. I didn't need to. I walked into the hallway to refill my water barefoot, the silence thick and still. I didn't expect him to be there. He stood near the kitchen, drinking from a glass, wearing only sweatpants, hair still wet from the shower. He saw me. Not glanced, not noticed. Saw I didn't flinch. I didn't look away either. We passed each other without a word, but my pulse was a drum in my ears, a low, slow warning that didn't feel like fear. That night, I lay in bed beside a man who didn't reach for me. He never did. It was never cruelty. He simply stopped seeing the point, I think. We were companions now. Polite, comfortable, safe. And for the longest time, I convinced myself that was enough. But lately, my skin craved more than warmth. It missed the sting of urgency, the pull of fingers against fabric, the breathless weight of being desired. I had forgotten the language of tension. That silence at the dinner table had taught me its first new word. The next morning, he was already at the kitchen table when I came downstairs. Coffee in front of him, one earbud in, I poured my own and sat across. My husband was gone, early meeting. The room was quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator. He looked up. Just briefly, didn't mean to surprise you last night. He said, you didn't. I replied too quickly. He smiled just a little. The kind of smile that doesn't spread far but stays curled at the edge of the mouth like it has somewhere to go, but isn't in a rush. Later that day, I changed the sheets in his room. Not out of necessity. Just because I wanted to touch the space he touched, I added a small lamp, rearranged the books on the shelf he hadn't opened. A strange thing tending to someone you're not supposed to think about. But I'd long since learned that care often hides where words never go. That evening, I found myself lingering in the kitchen again, not out of hunger, not really, just waiting. I hated the way. Time slowed when I anticipated his presence, and yet I stayed. When he entered, he leaned against the counter and asked, "Is this house always this quiet?" It used to be peaceful. I said, "Lately it feels underlined, like something important's about to be said, but no one's brave enough to say it." He didn't answer right away. Then, "I think people say a lot without speaking." I nodded. I felt him watching me again. Not my face, but the way my fingers held the stem of the wine glass, the slow way I exhaled. He wasn't flirting, that was what made it worse. He was studying. That night I chose different underwear. Not because I expected anything, just for myself. Burgundy lace, soft to the touch. I looked at myself in the mirror longer than I needed to. It wasn't vanity. It was hunger. Not for praise, but for reflection. For recognition lying beside my husband, I felt the space between our bodies like an ocean. His breathing steady content, mine measured forced. I turned to the side and whispered, "Do you remember the last time you touched me without it being out of habit?" He didn't stir. Maybe asleep? Maybe pretending? My phone lit up, a notification from the young man. "Thanks for the wine and the metaphor." I stared at the screen. I didn't respond, but I didn't delete it either. The following. Days passed with a deceptive stillness, the kind that settles over a landscape just before the rain. We moved through the house like practiced strangers, polite nods in the morning, brief exchanges in the kitchen, the occasional crossing of paths in the hallway. But beneath that quiet choreography, something was uncoiling. I felt it in the way my breath caught when I heard his footsteps on the stairs, in how my hands lingered too long on the towel he left in the bathroom. Nothing had happened, not really yet everything had begun. My husband remained absorbed in his routine. Meetings, phone calls, dinner in front of the TV. I no longer tried to compete with that rhythm I had learned over time, that absence doesn't always scream. Sometimes it hums in the background of your life until you mistake it for silence. That Saturday, he left early for a business retreat, 2 nights, maybe 3. He kissed my cheek as he left, his lips brushing skin like paper. I didn't ask when he'd be back. He didn't offer. The house felt different without him. Not freer, just quieter in a way that didn't pretend to be comforting. I poured coffee in the kitchen, wearing a thin cotton top. No bra underneath. It was warm out. But I knew what I was doing. I could feel the air on my skin, the fabric brushing against me when I moved. It wasn't about seduction, not consciously. It was about sensation, reclaiming some piece of myself that had gone dormant. He walked in, barefoot, hair damp, again rubbing at his neck with a towel. We locked eyes for a second too long, both of us recognizing the strange intimacy that had taken root. He poured himself coffee without a word and leaned against the counter, glancing. At the sunlight spilling in through the window, I told him I needed help bringing down the last of the storage boxes from the top shelf in the garage. He followed me there. No questions asked. The garage was musty with dust and disuse. I pointed toward the upper shelf, and he climbed up onto the stepladder. Without hesitation, I steadied the base, pretending not to notice the curve of his waist as his shirt lifted. He handed down a plastic container and turned to step down, but he misjudged the last rung and stumbled slightly, catching my shoulder to regain balance. His hand was warm, firm. It stayed there longer than necessary. He apologized quietly, his palm still pressed against me, fingers grazing the fabric of my top. I didn't answer. My body had already answered for me. We brought the box inside and set it down by the hallway. I thanked him too formally, too quickly. He nodded but didn't leave. He stood in the doorway of the living room, arms crossed, watching. As I opened the container and started removing old books and cables, "Do you need help organizing all this?" he asked. "No," I said, but my voice wavered. He didn't move. Then I said it, not looking at him, not looking anywhere. "Actually, yes. Could you stay a little longer?" He sat beside me on the rug, the box between us. We pretended to sort through things for a while. A stack of paperbacks, tangled extension cords, photo frames I hadn't seen in years. One of them had my husband's graduation picture. I stared at it for a moment, then placed it face down. I became aware of how close he was only when I shifted slightly and our shoulders touched. Neither of us moved. I could feel the heat from his skin, the steady rhythm of his breathing. My fingers trembled slightly as I picked up a cable, trying to untangle it. He reached over, took it gently from me. His hands brushed mine. Still no words. Just breath, then barely above a whisper. "Your hands are cold." I turned my head to him. His eyes didn't look away. He leaned forward, and this time I didn't freeze. I didn't calculate the risk or the morality or the weight of the betrayal. I simply moved toward him. His lips met mine like something remembered, not newly discovered. The kiss wasn't hesitant. It wasn't rough either. It was full slow, the kind that makes your knees forget how to hold you. His hand slid around my waist, careful but insistent. My own fingers found the back of his neck, the damp strands of hair still clinging there. I didn't stop it. I didn't want to. After what felt like an entire season passed in a single breath, we pulled away. Neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't awkward, it was dense, weighted with all the things we weren't ready to say. He stood first slowly. His eyes stayed on me for a moment, as if asking a question without actually voicing it. "I'll let you finish up," he said, voice low, neutral always. Too neutral. And then he was gone up the stairs, the sound of his door closing quieter than the blood pounding in my ears. I stayed on the floor. I didn't move for a long time. My lips still tingled. My skin felt too tight. I wasn't ashamed. That was the worst part. I wasn't anything not broken, not elated, not conflicted. I was simply awake. Later, I stood in the bathroom and looked at my reflection. My cheeks were flushed. There was a small smudge of mascara beneath one eye. My collarbone was red where his thumb had rested. I touched it gently, the memory of his hand echoing under my skin. I thought about texting him. Just one word. Come. Or maybe nothing. Just a question mark. Instead, I showered, took my time, chose a fresh set of underwear, black lace, soft elastic. Not for anyone else. For the woman in the mirror who had finally remembered what it felt like to be seen. I lay in bed that night and didn't sleep for hours. The silence didn't scare me. The memory of his mouth did not, because it had crossed a line, but because I already knew it wouldn't be the last time. I avoided mirrors the next morning. Not because of guilt, there was none, at least not yet. What I felt was something closer to instability, like walking across a frozen lake and hearing the first long crack beneath your feet. I still had time to turn back, but something in me didn't want to. He was already in the kitchen when I came down. His hair was messy, his t-shirt loose and wrinkled. He looked tired, but there was a sharpness in his glance when he saw me, like recognition. I poured my coffee slowly, aware of the silence, the heavy awareness of what had passed between us. We didn't speak. Not then. Just exchanged brief, almost professional glances, as if we were pretending nothing had happened on the floor beside that storage box, and yet something had shifted. It wasn't just memory that made my palms warm when he walked past me. It was the gravity of knowing that we'd already broken through a boundary, and nothing on the other side was going to feel the same. Later that day, my husband returned. His voice filled the house again like background static. He kissed me on the forehead. I smiled. Because it was expected, he unpacked with the usual commentary. The traffic, the weather, the bad food. I nodded and asked all the right questions. I didn't look at him for too long at dinner. I set the table for 3. The plates were arranged, neatly as always. He sat at his usual place, phone to the side, and scrolled between bites. I asked him about a document he forgot to sign last week. He grunted something vague. Across from me, the young man sat straighter, his fork still in his hand. He was watching me again. Not obviously, but intently. Under the table, our feet almost touched. I moved mine slightly, just an inch closer. I didn't plan it. I just didn't move it back. When our knees brushed, I didn't flinch. I didn't look up. I simply felt the warmth of that contact, like a warning and a promise rolled into one. My husband, oblivious, was reading headlines aloud, something about a banking merger. His voice blurred into nothing. I excused myself early, claimed a headache. My body didn't hurt, but something inside me pulsed, deep, distracted, impatient. Upstairs, I changed into sleepwear slowly. A loose tank top, no bra, and the same black lace beneath I didn't intend for him to see, but a part of me was dressing in case. I didn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening for footsteps. Nothing came. In the morning, my husband left early for work. I pretended to be asleep when he kissed my cheek. His lips were dry, perfunctory. I waited until I heard the car pull out of the driveway, then I got up and made coffee. He was already in the living room, lounging on the sofa with a book he clearly wasn't reading. I hesitated in the doorway, then walked in and set a mug beside him. Thanks. He said simple neutral. Like the air hadn't been charged between us for 3 days. I'm going for a walk later. I said, by the lake. Alone? He asked, not looking up. I guess. He closed the book but didn't answer. I left the room. By the time I reached the trail near the lake, the sky had turned a pale, washed-out blue, the kind of light that softens everything. Even thoughts I wore, a thin cardigan over a camisole, tight jeans, flat shoes, everything practical. Everything deliberate. The gravel crunched under my feet in rhythm with my breath. I felt myself exhale more freely here under trees that didn't ask questions. I needed this walk not for exercise but for distance, to stretch the space. Between what had happened and what might I didn't hear his steps behind me, only noticed him when I turned around and found him there, hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. You followed me? I asked. Yeah. He said, I didn't want to. That made me laugh, a dry, bitter little sound that wasn't quite humor. Then why did you? I don't know. He said, but I'm here. We sat on a bench near the edge of the water. The trees moved above us, branches scraping. Against each other like brittle secrets, I stared at the surface of the lake. It was still unbroken, reflecting nothing back. I shouldn't be thinking about you, I said quietly. I know. I turned my head and looked at him. But you are, he didn't deny it. It's not just physical. Don't lie to me, I said, sharper than I intended. Of course it's physical. It is. But not only. The silence between us held like glass, fragile, dangerous. Then he reached out, just his hand resting near mine on the bench. Not touching. Just waiting. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I let the space between our fingers burn like a fuse. Later that evening, back at the house, I was quiet. I cooked dinner, washed dishes, answered my husband's questions with soft, efficient replies. He didn't notice the difference. Or maybe he did and chose not to ask. Sometimes silence is an answer people accept because they're too tired to fight in bed. I lay still, while he read beside me. The light from his tablet cast a dull glow on his face. He didn't touch me. I didn't touch him. When he turned out the light and rolled away, I stared at the ceiling and whispered something I didn't want anyone to hear. Not a confession. Not regret. A name. Not his. I fell asleep with my heart kicking against the cage of my ribs like something alive that had just remembered how to move. I started looking at time differently. Not in days or hours or routines, but in glances, in the weight of unsaid things across a hallway, in how long it took his fingers to graze mine when we passed each other, something. Everything slowed down and sharpened. The smallest moments now felt like loaded gestures, and what scared me wasn't how quickly it had happened. It was how quietly I had let it in. The tension wasn't cinematic. It wasn't charged with thunder or violins. It was subtle, almost polite, but it crept into the corners of everything, into the way I touched my neck when he entered a room, into the way he waited for me to say something before he left one. There was no plan, no game, just a slow, undeniable gravitation. That week, my husband had suggested I take a break from the house. Go somewhere, breathe a little, you've looked tense lately. He'd said it without looking up from his laptop. I didn't know if he meant it out of care or guilt or sheer disinterest, but the offer landed like a door cracking open. I told him I might go to the museum. A quiet day to clear my head. What I didn't tell him was that I invited someone to come with me. It wasn't framed as a date. I didn't dress like it was. A beige sweater, fitted jeans, clean makeup, hair loose. Casual, forgettable. But underneath it, I wore navy silk bra and matching underwear. Something only I would know was there. That secret layer beneath the normalcy of everything else. He met me outside the museum. His shirt was dark, sleeves rolled up. He smiled when he saw me briefly, sincerely, without trying to make anything of it. We didn't touch. We didn't talk much either. The kind of silence between us had shifted, less tense, more aware. Inside, we moved slowly through the galleries, each room colder and quieter than the last. The exhibits didn't matter. I barely saw them. I watched the way his eyes traced paintings, the way he stood too close but didn't touch. I noticed how he leaned in when I spoke low and how he smiled without showing teeth. We stood in front of a sculpture for too long. Something abstract, bronze and fluid and almost human. I stared at it because I didn't trust myself to stare at him. Used to come here a lot, I said, alone. Always. He nodded. I didn't ask if he understood what I meant. I think he did. When we exited, the sky had shifted. It was that mid-afternoon gray that flattens the light, makes everything feel like the inside of a quiet room. We didn't speak as we walked toward the parking garage before unlocking my car. I paused. He was behind me, close enough that I could feel his presence, but not his breath. I turned toward him slowly. "Do you regret it?" I asked. Not explaining what it meant. Not needing to, no. He said steady, "Do you?" I didn't answer. We stood there in the concrete hush of the garage, the sound of tires echoing somewhere far below. I leaned back. Against the side of the car, the metal cold through my sweater. He stepped forward just once. The distance evaporated. He looked at my mouth. Not with urgency, but something else, like memory. "Are you going to kiss me again?" I asked. "No." He said, "Not here." I hated how much I wanted him to be lying. Back at home, the silence returned like something owed. My husband was in the kitchen pouring wine. He greeted me the way you greet someone who's been out doing nothing of consequence. I asked about his day. He told me about a new client. We sat on the sofa and watched the news. His hand rested on my knee. I tried not to flinch later that night. He came to bed early. It was rare. He brushed his hand against my hip beneath the sheets. I didn't move away. I didn't move closer either. He leaned over and kissed my shoulder. His breath was warm. I missed this. He said. I closed my eyes. I let him kiss me. Let him touch me. But my mind was elsewhere, on the shape of someone else's hand, on the echo of a quiet museum room, on bronze that looked like flesh. When he finished, he rolled to the side and whispered, "You've been distant lately." I waited, then said, "Just tired." I could feel him watching me in the dark, but he didn't ask more. Maybe because he didn't want to hear what might come next. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. I took a longer shower. Shaved everything, lotioned my skin. I wore my softest set black mesh, low cut, deliberately delicate. Then jeans, a white shirt, a gray blazer. Nothing suggestive on the surface, but underneath I felt like a lit match. He was in the living room again this time, scrolling something on his phone. I said I needed help with something upstairs, something in the storage closet. He followed me without a word. Upstairs, the hallway was dim. I opened the closet slowly, pretending to search for something. He stood behind me, close enough that his chest brushed my shoulder. "Did you find it?" he asked. "No." I said. He didn't move. I turned slightly, still facing the open closet, and said, "Sometimes I pretend everything's fine." He didn't answer, but I'm tired of pretending. I added, softer now. His hand rested on the side of the closet door just above mine. His thumb moved once, brushing the edge of my wrist. It wasn't a grab, it wasn't even bold, but it was deliberate, and I didn't stop it. We didn't kiss then. We didn't even look at each other. We just stood there, heat rising between us like pressure behind glass. Neither of us moved first, but we would, and soon. It began with a note. Nothing elaborate, just a folded piece of paper left on the small hallway table. Between our rooms. The handwriting wasn't neat. Just quick, almost cautious, like it wasn't sure whether it should exist at all. "Be home at 2. Don't knock." I read it 3 times before tucking it into the side pocket of my robe. My hand trembled slightly when I did not, from fear that part had already burned out, but from the sheer weight of anticipation. I felt it pressing against my chest with every passing minute. That morning, I played the part. I made coffee, answered a client call, folded laundry. The domestic rituals of distraction. My husband had left for the day. A last-minute client meeting, he said, followed by drinks. He wouldn't be home until late. His voice on the phone had been brisk, efficient. Grateful that I hadn't asked questions. By noon, I began preparing. Not hurriedly, not like a teenager sneaking around. This wasn't a secret to be ashamed of. Not yet. It was a decision I had already made, long before any note appeared. Showered slowly, shaved everything. Toweled off with care. When I stepped in front of the mirror, I took my time choosing. Not red that felt too obvious. Not white too innocent, I chose dark green. A delicate set with thin straps and high cut. Sides that hugged my hips just enough to remind me that I still had them. I pulled a long linen skirt over it, and a black top that dipped low in the back. No jewelry, just perfume behind the knees and collarbone. I waited in the living room with a book I wasn't reading. The words blurred on the page. At 1:52, I closed it. At 1:57, I stood. At 2, Prowler, I opened his door. He was sitting on the edge of the bed as if he'd been waiting the entire time. His expression wasn't expectant. It wasn't nervous either. He looked steady. Still. But when our eyes met, I saw the flicker, the one that had started weeks ago and hadn't dimmed since. I closed the door behind me and didn't say a word. I walked to the window and adjusted the curtain slightly, though the light was already muted. My hand lingered on the fabric. I could feel him watching me, the rise and fall of his breath behind me like a second presence. I didn't think you'd... Chump, he said. I turned slowly. Then you don't know me. He didn't move from the bed. Neither did I. The silence between us wasn't empty anymore. It was full of all the things we hadn't said, the way my hand had brushed his in the hallway. Last night. The way we'd stood shoulder to shoulder, not touching, not breathing, waiting for something to snap. Now it had I took a step toward him, then another. When I reached him, I stopped just close enough for my knees to touch his. He didn't. Reach for me. He waited. The stillness made my skin burn. I leaned down slowly, hands at my sides. My lips met his, like we had done this before, like it wasn't a question anymore. But the answer, his mouth was warm, familiar and entirely different from the man I had married. There was no routine in it. No obligation, only need. Raw, slow-burning, dangerously patient. He kissed me back with restraint. Not because he lacked urgency, but because he knew instinctively that the waiting was part of what made it unbearable. My hand slid to his neck, his fingers to the hem of my skirt, resting just at the edge of my thigh, not moving further. That restraint said more than any hurried grab ever could. When we finally pulled apart, neither of us smiled. This wasn't playful, it wasn't flirtation, it was admission. I sat beside him on the bed. My shoulder brushed his arm, our thighs touched. He turned his head slightly and exhaled the sound slow and deliberate. I shouldn't want this, he said. It wasn't a protest, it was a confession, but you do. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. We stayed there like that for a long time, bodies not intertwined, but lined up aligned. Two people who knew they had passed, the point of no return, and who for whatever reason didn't feel the need to apologize for it. After I left his room, I didn't go to mine. I went to the kitchen. I poured water, washed my hands, wiped the counter that wasn't dirty. I kept myself moving. The echoes of his breath still clung to my skin. I could still feel his mouth on mine when I touched my lips with the back of my hand. I was putting a dish back into the cupboard when the front door opened. My husband stepped inside too. Early, I froze. He didn't notice. He was talking something about the client canceling lunch, about traffic on the highway. I smiled and nodded. I couldn't hear a word. My ears were full of blood. I think I'm going to lie down. I said, sure. He replied, everything okay? I hesitated. Yeah, just a bit of a headache. He kissed my temple and walked into the study. I stood alone in the kitchen, my heart a wild pulsing thing against my ribs. Not from guilt, from the realization that I had crossed something that couldn't be undone. Not in thought, not in body, not in breath. That night in bed, my husband turned toward me. He rested a hand on my back and said, "You've been so quiet lately. I swallowed. I've just been thinking a lot about us, about everything. He nodded slowly as if that answer was enough, but it wasn't. Not for me. Not anymore. And in the dark, when his hand slid lower, I didn't stop him, but I also didn't close my eyes, because in my mind I was somewhere else entirely, and that somewhere had green lace and heat and silence that didn't lie. The next morning, I woke up with his hand still resting on my waist. My husband's breath was soft against my shoulder, slow and regular. For a moment, I just lay there perfectly still. My eyes opened to the dim light filtering through the curtains. I counted the seconds between his inhales and exhales, trying to ground myself in something familiar. Something that wasn't sliding out from under me. There was a strange kind of clarity in my chest, a dull ache that had nothing to do with sorrow and everything to do with detachment. I was here in this bed next to a man who thought he had just made love to his wife. And I had let him. I had moved, as expected. Breathed when he did, matched his rhythm like a learned dance. But I hadn't felt anything. Not warmth, not guilt, not even resistance. Just absence. The shape of someone else taking up all the space where feeling used to be. He stirred slightly and pressed a faint kiss to my back before getting out of bed. I heard the sound of his phone unlocking his slippers on the hardwood floor. The soft click of the bathroom door. I stayed, still eyes open, staring at nothing. I thought about the green lace tucked into the bottom drawer of my vanity, about the note that was still folded neatly inside my purse, now hidden in the linen closet, about his mouth on mine the way he hadn't touched me beyond my face and hips, and how that restraint had burned deeper than anything else ever had. I got up, slowly wrapped myself in a robe, and made my way downstairs. The morning light in the kitchen was sharp, unforgiving. I welcomed it. I brewed coffee, scrambled eggs, toasted bread, mechanical gestures I could do in my sleep. He came down minutes later, tie crooked, buttoning the cuff of his sleeve. "You didn't have to make breakfast," he said absently. "I wanted to." I lied, handing him a plate. He ate quickly, scrolling through emails, responding between bites. I sat across from him, holding my mug in both hands, nodding when necessary, smiling on cue. He didn't look at me much. He rarely did in the mornings. I used to take it personally. Now it felt like permission. After he left for the office, I stood in the hallway for a while, staring at the closed front door. The silence in the house settled around me again like a second skin. I didn't move for several minutes. I just let the quiet remind me of what I was now capable of. Upstairs. I passed his room, the other one. The door was closed, but I didn't need to open it. I could still feel the ghost of yesterday beneath my fingernails. I went into my own room, sat at the vanity, and stared at my reflection. There were no marks, no lipstick smudges, no bruises, no giveaways. But I looked different. There was something sharper in my eyes, something I couldn't disguise even if I wanted to. I dressed with care that day, not extravagantly, just with intention. A soft blouse tucked into high-waisted pants, hair pulled back but loosely enough to seem effortless. No lipstick, just a trace of gloss. I wore perfume again this time. The one he had once mentioned smelled like the inside of a forest. It wasn't about seduction anymore, it was about readiness. I spent the afternoon in the garden pulling weeds that didn't need to be pulled, cutting flowers that had only just bloomed. I wasn't thinking, not in words, just movements. It helped. When I came back inside, he was at the sink drinking a glass of water. We hadn't spoken all day. His presence in the kitchen wasn't surprising, but still made something in me flutter low and immediate. "You were outside long," he said. I needed the air. He nodded, didn't press. I turned to wash my hands, standing beside him, the water rushing between my fingers. I could feel his eyes on me, but he didn't speak again. And neither did I. That evening, my husband came home in a particularly talkative mood. Some meeting had gone well. He opened a bottle of wine, poured generously. Insisted we eat dinner together in the dining room for once, not in front of the TV. I obliged, I was gracious, I asked questions, I smiled at all the right times, but under the surface, I was somewhere else entirely. He talked about plans for a short weekend trip. Just us, he said. Get out of the house, hit the coast walk on the beach, we need that. I agreed, or at least I didn't disagree. After dinner, he reached for my hand as we cleared the plates, his thumb brushed the inside of my wrist. The gesture was gentle, familiar, and yet it felt like being touched by a stranger, a warm, well-meaning stranger. Later that night, we lay in bed again. He touched me. I let him, but it felt like following someone else's choreography. I moved in rhythm. I moaned softly. I closed my eyes, but all I could feel was the space in between who I was and who I'd become, between the hands on my body and the ones I ached for. When he finally fell asleep, I stayed. Awake, I stared at the ceiling again, listening to the hum of the fan, the occasional creak of the floorboards. My skin felt wrong, my chest too tight. My mind wouldn't rest. I got up, wrapped myself in a blanket, and went downstairs. I sat on the living room couch, curled into myself, staring out the window at the darkness beyond the yard. I wasn't thinking about what I had done. I was thinking about what I wanted next. Not escape, not comfort, just truth in whatever form it demanded. To arrive behind me, footsteps, slow, deliberate. I didn't turn. He sat beside me, silent. Neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. The room was dark, but something had begun to glow. The invitation came from my husband unexpectedly. A weekend in the Gaze countryside. He had booked a small rental house, the kind with too much wood and not enough signal, thinking it would do us good. "It'll clear our heads," he said over breakfast, smiling like someone still convinced there was something left to repair. I nodded, agreed. I didn't ask questions. He suggested we invite his son too. It might be good for all of us. He added, his voice almost careful. And I knew at that moment that he knew something. Maybe not. Everything not. The shape of what had begun to form between his wife and his son, but enough to feel the shifts in the room, the pause between glances, the energy that no longer bent toward him. I pretended to hesitate, then agreed. He might like the change of scenery. I offered, as if it were about the scenery. The drive up was uneventful, quiet even. I watched the road blur by while my husband spoke intermittently about the house, the lake nearby, the grill on the back patio that was supposedly perfect for the weather. I nodded at intervals. The young man sat in the back seat, his gaze out the window, one headphone in. We didn't look at each other much, but I felt every mile tighten the distance between where we had been and where we were going. The house was modest, all exposed beams and soft rugs, with a kitchen that smelled of cedar and thyme. My husband set his things down and declared himself exhausted. He opened a bottle of wine and poured 3 glasses. I took mine and slipped outside while the two of them unloaded groceries. The air was sharp, full of pine and silence. That night the fire crackled too loudly. We sat together in the living room, the three of us, wine half-drunk, stories half-told. My husband dozed off early in the armchair, chin to chest, the glass still in his hand. I stood to take it gently, his fingers releasing it without waking. Then I turned. He was watching me again, his gaze unreadable. He didn't move, didn't blink, and I didn't break the stare. I walked into the kitchen, set the glass in the sink, and stood with both hands braced on the edge of the counter. Behind me, I heard the soft creak of floorboards. I didn't turn. When he stepped close, the warmth of his body filled the space behind mine like it had always belonged there. "This is dangerous," I whispered. "No," came the answer, but I didn't step away, and neither did he. His fingers brushed the side of my wrist, barely there, but enough to make my breath catch. We stood like that, the hum of the refrigerator masking our silence, the firelight flickering behind us in the other room. The sound of the chair shifting didn't come. "My husband slept on. We need to stop," I said. But my voice didn't carry the conviction it should have. I could hear it. "I tried," he murmured. "I tried harder than you think." I turned, then slowly, our faces just inches apart. "You think I didn't?" The stillness cracked. I felt his hand slide to my waist. The touch was light, as if waiting for permission, and I gave it, not in words, but in the way I leaned in and how my fingers closed around his forearm. The kiss was inevitable. It wasn't rushed. It was quiet, deliberate, deeper than any confession. We were past denial now. We were in the echo of it. When it ended, we didn't speak. We stood like statues in that dim kitchen, every breath a question without an answer. I pulled away first, carefully, slowly, and turned back toward the counter. My hands trembled when I reached for the faucet. He left the room without a sound. The next morning, my husband made eggs and hummed to himself. He asked if we'd slept well. I said yes. I avoided the young man's eyes. The dining room was filled with the sound of clinking forks and mild conversation. The table between us felt like a stage. That afternoon, we walked around the lake, the three of us, but somehow always in pairs. First, he and I trailed behind while my husband photographed the trees. Then my husband took my hand briefly and the other walked ahead. There was a moment by the water where he stopped crouched to pick up a flat stone and skipped it across the lake's surface. I watched the ripples expand outward until they were swallowed by the stillness again. And I wondered if that's what we were. Something brief, thrown hard, destined to disappear without a trace. That night after dinner, my husband fell asleep early again. His son stayed outside by the patio. The light from his phone glowing faintly in the darkness, I stepped out. Quietly, the air was colder now. The stars above us were sharp and bright and merciless. We stood in silence for a long time. I don't know what we're doing. I said eventually, I think we do. I mean, what comes after this? I don't think we're supposed to know. I looked at him, then really looked, not at his face or his youth or the way he filled a space without trying, but at the pull he had on me. The magnetism that had stopped being about lust long ago. It had become something quieter, something more dangerous. A form of belief, a mirror I didn't know I needed. Do you regret it? I asked again. He shook his head. Only the part where it has to end. We stood in the cold until our glasses emptied, and the silence no longer felt like avoidance. It felt like understanding. When I returned inside, I didn't go straight to bed. I passed the mirror in the hallway and paused. I barely recognized the woman staring back. Not because she had changed, but because she had stepped out of the role she'd been cast in years ago. Wife, caregiver, witness. Now she was something else entirely. And for the first time, I wasn't sure whether that terrified me or thrilled me. We drove back. In silence, 3 bodies enclosed in the hum of the car, each facing forward, each privately calculating the weight of what had been left behind in that wooden house. My husband talked less than usual. He tapped on the steering wheel during the long stretch of highway, occasionally glancing at signs, his mouth pressed into a straight, unreadable line. I sat in the passenger seat with my hands folded in my lap, watching the trees blur by. In the back seat, he slept or pretended to. The quiet wasn't unfamiliar. We'd known this version of stillness before, the one built from fatigue and the routine of long-term marriage. But this time it had depth, a pressure. As if each of us had become painfully aware that things were no longer aligning the way they had been supposed to. When we got home, I unpacked mechanically, folded sweaters, sorted laundry, placed our shoes in the hallway, like it mattered. I noticed the smallest things. How his socks were balled unevenly, how my husband's scent lingered in the suitcase longer than I expected. I lit a candle in the living room, vanilla and sandalwood. Something grounding. He stayed in his room most of the day. I knew without asking that he wasn't avoiding me. It wasn't retreat. It was the recognition that we had crossed a threshold we could no longer deny, and now we each needed to sit in the stillness of what we'd become. By evening, the air in the house was thick again, not with tension, but with suspended questions. My husband invited me to sit with him on the couch. He poured us both wine and muted the television. We should talk, he said. I waited. My heart didn't race. My hands didn't tremble. There was no dramatic music, no rush of guilt. Just a slow ache, like pressing on a bruise you forgot you had. I've been noticing something with you. His voice was low, deliberate, as if he was still trying to decide how much he really wanted to know. You're quieter, distracted. I held the glass steady. Marriage gets quiet, I said. He nodded too quickly. But you're not just quiet, you're somewhere else. I looked at him then, and for the first time in months, I saw something fragile. In his expression, not anger, not suspicion, but something closer to grief. A recognition that he had stopped reaching for me long before anyone else ever dared to. You never ask me how I feel anymore. I said, You notice that? He blinked. Slowly, You always seemed fine. I was never fine. I replied, I was just functioning. He swallowed, the muscles in his jaw tightening. Is there someone else? I didn't answer. I didn't lie either. I looked away down at the edge of the wine glass, the light catching in its curved rim. He didn't press. He stood up slowly and walked into the kitchen. I stayed on the couch. I waited for the usual wave of panic to crash, but it didn't. Only a cold, calm acceptance spread through my body like ink in water. That night, I lay awake, listening to him breathe beside me. At some point, he had returned to bed, had slipped under the covers without touching me, without even brushing against me. The distance between us was only a few inches, but it might as well have been a continent. I stared at the ceiling, aware of every pulse, every memory, every line we'd both silently agreed not to cross until now. And then I left the bed. I padded down the hallway, barefoot each step, soft, slow, like walking through fog. I didn't knock, I didn't need to. He opened the door before I could reach for the handle. He didn't speak. He stepped aside, letting me in. I stood in the dim light of his room, my arms wrapped around myself, my heart a steady, slow drumbeat. He was wearing a loose t-shirt, gray, with age soft around the collar. His hair was slightly damp, as if he'd washed the day away. We faced each other in silence. I told him I wasn't. Fine, I said. For the first time, he nodded. I saw the conflict in his eyes, not fear, not guilt, but a question he didn't know how to ask. I don't want to lie anymore. I added. He didn't step toward me. He didn't reach. Just waited, and in that stillness, I felt more held than I had in months. Do you want me to stop? He asked, voice low. I thought about it. Really thought, no. I said, I want you to stop pretending this is just temporary. He exhaled. Not relief, not surprise. Something heavier. I moved closer. Not out of recklessness, but clarity. Every cell in my body felt like it had been recalibrated to a different rhythm, one that only responded to proximity, to breath shared in dim rooms, to the safety of being wanted in silence. We didn't kiss. Not that night. He touched my arm, then my shoulder. His thumb traced the line of my jaw. I closed my eyes and for the first time didn't feel like I had to disappear into someone else's desire. I could stay. I returned to my room just before dawn. My husband was still asleep, his back turned to my side of the bed. I lay down, eyes open, breath steady, my body still humming from something quieter than sex and louder than memory, and I realized that the worst wasn't the lie. The worst was that I had stopped waiting to be caught because I had already let myself go. The days that followed moved like water through cupped hands, slow at first, then impossible to hold. Nothing changed. In the visible sense, we still shared meals. My husband still left his shoes by the door, still asked whether I needed anything from the store, still talked about the upcoming quarter, like it meant something. We moved around each other like polite strangers occupying the same square footage bound by ritual and silence, but underneath everything had shifted. I stopped pretending I didn't wait for footsteps outside my door late at night. I stopped telling myself I didn't notice the change in how he stood near me, closer, braver, even when we were surrounded by the mundane clutter of daily life. And I stopped asking questions that I already knew the answers to. The final break didn't come with shouting or betrayal. There was no discovered message, no confrontation under dramatic lighting. Just a quiet morning, gray and windless, when my husband stood in the doorway with a packed bag at his feet and a folded shirt in his hands. He held it for a long moment before setting it down gently on the armrest of the couch. I'm going to stay at my brother's for a while, he said. stood at the kitchen counter, the edge of a coffee mug still warm beneath my fingers. I didn't turn to face him immediately. I needed a second, maybe two, to breathe through the wave of numbness that hit my chest. Not grief, not guilt, just the unspoken knowing that what had barely been held together was finally quietly being let go. I didn't want this. I said, my voice thin, dry. Not like this. He nodded once. I believe you. The bag made a soft sound when he lifted it, the zipper brushing against his leg. He didn't slam the door. He didn't ask me why. And I didn't offer the truth. I think part of him had known for longer than I had. Not the details. Never the details, but the absence. He'd felt the absence long before either of us had the courage to name it. After the car pulled out of the driveway, I stood at the window for a long time. The sun hadn't yet broken through the clouds. The trees barely moved. Even the birds seemed to sense the shift in the atmosphere behind me. The silence was thicker than ever. He didn't come downstairs right away. I imagined him pacing, pausing, maybe listening. I didn't call for him. I didn't move. When he finally appeared in the kitchen doorway, there was nothing triumphant in his expression, no trace of possession or conquest, only hesitation. Caution, I poured him coffee. He took it with a simple nod. We sat across from each other at the small table, two people surrounded by walls that had held too many secrets, too much longing, too much quiet. I didn't want this to happen like this. He said after a long pause, I know. I didn't come here to take something away from him. I don't think you did. He looked down at his hands, then at me. But I won't apologize for wanting you. That sentence sat between us like something sacred. I let it linger. Not because I didn't believe it, but because I needed time to absorb the full weight of what it meant. Wanting someone was one thing. Staying with them after the damage, after the choice, was something else entirely. That evening he cooked dinner. Not fancy, just pasta with garlic and lemon, but it filled the house with warmth. I watched him move around the kitchen with sleeves rolled up, a dish towel over one shoulder. It was such a normal scene that it felt almost surreal. The way domesticity suddenly looked different when filtered through new intimacy. After we ate, we didn't retreat to separate rooms. We stayed in the living room. Lights low, music playing from the corner speaker. Not romantic music, not seductive, just soft piano. Something atmospheric that left space between notes. He sat close to me on the couch, not touching, not pressing. Just there. Present in a way that felt entirely unlike anything I had known before. I don't expect you to know what comes next. He said, I don't. I admitted. He turned his head, eyes steady. Do you want to figure it out with me? The simplicity of the question pierced something inside me, because it wasn't a promise or a trap, it was just an offer. One that had been building silently in the corners of everything we had shared. Every glance, every almost touch, every kiss that felt more like a confession than a mistake. I didn't answer with words. I leaned into him, rested my head on his shoulder. His arm came around me without hesitation. We sat like that until the music stopped, until the air turned cool, until the silence no longer held tension, but peace. Later in bed, I lay awake again. Not with doubt, not with dread, just a quiet, persistent awareness that I was no longer the same woman who had gone to sleep beside her husband 2 weeks ago. I was someone new now, someone unrecognizable to the part of me that had accepted numbness as stability. I wasn't sure where the road would take us next, but for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was disappearing. Felt seen, not forgiven, not justified, just alive.